Welcome back, everyone. We are going to keep right on moving here into sustainability. Before we get started on that, I do want to remind you, I saw a few people sent some questions in for the Q&A session. If you have any questions over land values or sustainability, we are going to answer those all at the end during that Q&A session. So keep sending those in. We see them, but just know that we're going to answer everything in those sessions. So here to talk about sustainability is Craig Walter. Craig is a farm manager and licensed real estate salesperson here in Nevada, Iowa. Craig started with Hertz in June of 2018 after graduating from Iowa State with a bachelor's degree in agricultural business with minors in agronomy and ag systems technology. Craig, thanks for joining me. And with that, I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Great. Thanks, Casey. Well, it's great to be with you all this morning. Sustainability has been a trending topic in agriculture over the past several decades, and certainly over the past 5 to 10 years, it's been difficult to open a farm magazine without reading the word sustainability. So we've been talking about it for many years, but we still really don't have a true definition of sustainability as it relates to agriculture. And that's because there are a variety of ways that we can meet sustainability goals, and every farm is unique and will respond to practice changes differently. So we'll kind of dive into a few of those different topics here today. So let's just get into it. Casey, why don't you please go ahead and cue up the slide deck. All right. So today we'll try to define some of the goals of sustainability, look at how technology and farm practices and the different operations that are happening on farms relate to sustainability, different sustainable agronomic practices that we're using on farms, how water quality is being looked at, and then the new emerging market for carbon credits that you might have heard of. So let's step back and try to define some of the goals of sustainability. And to me, it comes to two main things. Number one, we need to allow farmers to continue to keep productivity high to meet our ever increasing demand and still remain financially sound. Number two, we need to find practices that fit those needs, that help reduce waste, reduce pollution, and allow us to continue to be good stewards of the soil and keep our farms viable for many generations to come. So let's dive into some of those finer points. By being more efficient with our inputs, we can both save money and reduce waste. So one example is the nitrogen that we apply for a corn crop. It can be susceptible to leaching in some points of the year, depending on weather and other things. So it can leach through the ground and enter our water sources. But as long as we're more efficient and we put exactly what the crop needs out there, and it can be used up and not be lost, then that's great. We can save money and reduce our waste. Along with that water quality and nutrient loss portion, we think about the nitrogen and phosphorus that can run off from the soil due to soil erosion. As it's attached to the soil particles, it can run off of the soil surface and then get into our water sources as well. So thinking again about applying the right rates and making sure that the crop is using exactly what we put out there. Again, thinking about water quality, it's certainly been a major topic, especially I know here in Central Iowa and many other parts of the country. So that's a big portion of it. Finally, what we're looking at improving, as I said, the farm viability for many years to come as it relates to the actual farm land. Thinking about healthier soil. So healthy soil is a difficult thing to measure. One, we're looking at increased organic matter, and we can do that in a variety of ways that we'll talk about later. But as you get out there and you just take a clod of soil and crumble it, you want that crumbly soil that can show that you've got a healthy soil. Maybe you'll see some earthworms out there that can show that you've got a lot of biological activity below the soil surface. That's another indication of a healthy soil. And then again, in that portion is reduced erosion, making sure that we're keeping that soil in place for many, many years to come. And then finally, that healthy soil portion can also play into the sequestering carbon, and we'll dive into that carbon portion later in the presentation. So we'll go into the technology portion and different farm operations that we're seeing being used. And I'll start with nutrient application. For many years, our nitrogen applications were all up front in the fall prior to that crop being grown. So we would apply it out there and just kind of cross our fingers and hope that it was there when the crop needed it during the growing season. Now we've switched many of our applications to be some up front in the fall, and then we might put a nitrogen stabilizer with that to help keep it stable in the soil and not lose it to leaching or things like that. And then we'll do various applications in the spring and then through the growing season as well to kind of spoon feed that crop exactly when it needs it. So that comes into the 4 R's of nutrient application. For one, applying the right rate. So we're not over applying, giving that crop exactly what it needs. So it's not lost to the different avenues that I talked about earlier. We're using the right source. So balancing the different nutrients that we need for that crop to grow, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, and the different micronutrients that we see out there as well. Putting it in the right place. So you can see in that photo on the right, as that tractor is moving across the field with that anhydrous ammonia applicator, the different colors that you see, the red and the yellow and the green, are representing different rates that are being applied. And those can be picked by different soil types, maybe yield history, and different things like that to help key in exactly what that crop will need in that portion of the farm. So that's putting it in the right place and making sure that we're applying it exactly where it needs to be applied. And then, as I talked about earlier, applying it at the right time, making sure that we're putting it out there when the crop needs it. And along with that picture on the right, there's different methods of variable rate that we can use. One is certainly fertilizer. Lime is another big one. So as you're liming to raise the pH on a farm, most of the time your farm will not need a huge quantity of lime across the entire thing. So we might use a variable rate application, and that'll save a lot of money and a lot of wasted product by doing that. And it can really pay off to use a variable rate application with lime. And then another one is seed. So applying it where it's going to be used most efficiently, we might put a higher rate in a certain area or a lower rate in a certain area, depending on soil types, yield history, those types of things. As far as machinery capabilities, we've had things like GPS and auto steer for a while now, but those technologies are only continuing to help our farmers be more efficient in their operations. So different guidance systems that might allow them to outline a waterway, that can help reduce waste rather than applying that nutrient or seed or whatever in places where it doesn't need to go. Another one is automatic suction control. So think about a planter going across the field and it knows exactly where it's planted. So if you happen to, as you're driving over that area again, it won't overlap and apply that seed again where it's already been planted. So that's another great way that farmers have been able to reduce waste and save a lot of money. And then another exciting technology is the ExactApply that John Deere has come out with for their sprayer technology. So each individual nozzle can be controlled differently, and it can sense the weeds that are out there. So we're only spraying exactly where it needs to be sprayed rather than applying chemical across the whole field. So we haven't seen that used a whole lot lately, but I know it's out there and it'll probably be implemented quite a bit here in the coming years. So then we'll dive into some of the agronomic practices that are being used. One is reduced tillage. You can see on the photo on the right is an example of a no-till soybeans. You can see the old corn stalks in between the rows. Reducing tillage could be anything from going from a full tillage system to cutting out a few different rounds of tillage and minimizing that. You could be using a strip till system where you're leaving that residue between the rows, but you're creating a seed bed exactly where the planter will go. And then it could be a full no-till system like that picture shows. It's very dependent on farm, very dependent on farm operation and the different equipment that you need for those things. So when we think about reduced tillage, number one, we're thinking about the amount of times that we're reducing our soil disturbance. So the fewer times that you have to disturb the soil and till it up, more often than not, it can help as far as soil health goes. and building that organic matter, that soil structure, those types of things to help your soil be healthier in the long term. We're also using that crop residue to help prevent soil erosion. So rather than tilling out in the fall, when you have that heavy precipitation event in the fall or the spring, you can use those corn stalks or whatever that might be to help reduce the impact on the soil, and you won't lose as much soil when those heavy precipitation events come. And all this can play into, you've got your decomposing crop residue on the surface, and that can help with your soil organic matter and those types of things as far as that goes. Finally, it can be a money saver in the long run. So you're making fewer trips across the field, you're saving labor, you're saving fuel. It might take some specialized equipment, but in the long term, usually farm operators have seen that they can save money this way. And ultimately, we have to remember that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So every farm will respond to reducing tillage differently. I know here in Story County, where we're working, a lot of these soils are heavier and they often respond to tillage. So they might not have as good of a response to reducing your tillage or doing full no-till. It's really a case-by-case basis. So it takes some planning and some thoughtful approaches if you're thinking about doing reduced tillage. Then we'll go into another trendy topic of cover crops. So this is an example of cover crops on a farm that I manage here in Story County. We had a seed corn crop on the farm that year. And then in September, we would come out with a drill and then drill that cereal rye seed where that seed corn was. That's a good fit because seed corn harvest is early and allows you to get in and get a good stand of growth with your cover crop. We had used a cover crop here mainly because we'd seen some weed resistance issues and we wanted to limit those. And it was just a good opportunity to help improve our soil health. Overall, I was really impressed with how that cover crop residue limited our weed competition, and it really did a nice job during the growing season of keeping our weeds out of the soybeans and gave us a good stand of soybeans. We did plant those soybeans directly into that cereal rye cover crop. This is what that picture shows. And really we planted them green, so the cover crop was still alive. And then about a week or two later, we came back and sprayed a herbicide and terminated the cover crop. So we'll talk about some of the benefits of cover crops. Again, similar to that reduced tillage portion, we're reducing our soil erosion, so limiting that raindrop impact and keeping the soil in place. As that cover crop is below ground and living with its roots, it can improve the organic matter, improve your soil structure, and increase your soil carbon. Soil structure, think about when the rainfall is coming. As if you have better soil structure, the rain will go right through the soil exactly where you want it to. But if you have poor soil structure, it might pond up on the surface, and you have, for one, you could limit your opportunity to get out in the field, or you could be limiting the potential for that crop if it's got water standing there. And like I talked about, that below ground biological activity, not only the roots, but that photo on the right shows a clod of soil from a cover crop field, and you can see an earthworm in that clod of soil, which is a good sign because it shows that that soil is promoting those earthworms or different microbes to live in that soil, showing that you've got good soil health. Like I talked about, suppressing weed pressure can be another benefit of cover crops. And you can certainly improve your water quality as you know the extra nutrients that are available after that crop, the previous crop, they can kind of be soaked in by the cover crop, and you'll keep that there on the farm. So thinking about the different considerations if you wanted to do a cover crop. again, every farm is going to respond to use of a cover crop differently, depending on soil types. Some of the heavier black soils might not respond to them as well, but it takes different management and takes some experimenting to understand how that might work. Again, think about when you can establish the cover. If you're not harvesting your corn crop until mid to late October, you're really not going to get very good growth from that cover crop because there's just limited amount of time in the fall for it to get good growth. And that early fall growth is really one of the main benefits. If you can get a good stand in the fall and protect the soil over the winter, that's one of the main things that you're looking for with a cover crop. And geography can play a factor in that too, not only crop rotation, but your geography. Up north, we've seen lower adoption of cover crops because of the shorter growing season. And thinking about your crop rotation, how are you going to till that next crop? If you don't want to no-till into your cover crop, oftentimes you're really kind of defeating the purpose of what you did, unless you're doing something like strip till and you're keeping that cover crop out there. If you just till it up again, then you really don't have the benefits of what you did. So think about that as well. And then think about how and when your cover might be terminated for that growing crop the next year. That's another consideration for management. One of the big hurdles of cover crops has been the cost. Oftentimes it'll take $25 up to $50 per acre, depending on the seed mix that you use and depending on your application style. So that's been one of the big things that has prohibited cover crops from being adopted widely, in our opinion. And there is some USDA cost share available out there, so keep that in mind as well if you're thinking about adopting it. So we talked about some of those agronomic practices, and again, I want to stress that those are kind of not necessarily a one-size-fits-all, and they might not fit your farm, but it might be worth thinking about at least. So we'll dive into some of the water quality topics, and one of the ways that we've been improving our water quality is a saturated buffer. So a saturated buffer basically helps us control our tile-drained water before it enters a stream. The diagram on the right, so the left side shows your conventional tile outlet. Basically, your tile outlet will go straight from the field and dump right into the stream. On the right, you can see there's a control structure. So it fills up with that water from the outlet before it enters the stream. And then from that control structure, you will install some tile laterally through a grass buffer strip. As that tile is diverted laterally through the buffer strip, the grass will basically just take up the nitrates and convert it into a harmless nitrogen gas. So it's been shown to be a pretty effective way of removing nitrates and limiting nitrates in our water. I've seen a study that showed an average of 61% nitrate removal, but I know it can certainly be higher than that, and the range has shown lower than that. It's really a case-by-case basis how well it has worked. These systems can treat up to 200 acres, but you have to remember that it requires adequate field slope for that tile to run and drain into that control outlet, and then enough space in the field for an ample buffer strip. Typically, they take $2,000 to $4,000 to install. There's some cost share available out there, but they are pretty low maintenance. Really no worries about having any maintenance on them throughout the lifetime. Here's a better diagram that can kind of show you from an entire field. So that red dot in the middle will show you where that control structure is, where the water will run into, and then the yellow lines going east and west show that lateral tile where the water is being diverted and then soaked up by that buffer strip. And then the line going north and south shows you that typical tile outlet. Here's a photo of one of those control structures being installed on a farm. And then here's a photo showing those lateral tile distributing from that control structure. So another project similar to a saturated buffer is a bioreactor. So again, you've got your conventional tile outlet, and then it runs into a control structure. But rather than diverting it laterally throughout a grass strip, you put that water into a big pit filled with wood chips. Those wood chips have bacteria in them that will basically convert that nitrate into a nitrogen gas again, and then that water goes out into the stream once it's clean. So we're looking, again, you're removing the nitrates from that tile drain water. These have shown to be maybe a little less effective, a range from 15 to 60%. Really not a whole lot of evidence of them out there. They just have not been implemented on a wide scale yet. They'll typically handle up to 80 acres of drainage. They are a little costlier, about $10,000 to install. Some cost share out there, but those wood chips need to be replaced every 10 years. So a little bit higher maintenance than that saturated buffer when you think about that. I've seen here locally, certain counties and certain watersheds, they've even been putting these in for free for landowners. So you might think about that and think about opportunities that you might have. Maybe that they're not available yet, but they could be out there in the future. Here's some photos of that bioreactor being installed. They're digging the pit there on the top left and then filling it with wood chips, covering it, and then planting that grass on top. So we'll dive into a little bit of the water quality portion. You might have heard of water credits. So basically we're looking again at reducing the different pollutants in the water, especially in agriculture. Nitrates is the main one. So different corporations and cities and different groups are offering to purchase water credits to reduce their own nitrate or phosphate pollution impact. I know I've heard that the city of Cedar Rapids has been a player in this early, but they're really not widely available yet. We could see this coming in the near future with the increased initiative to reduce those pollutants. So it's another way that you might be incentivized for water quality improvements on your farm in the future. So now we'll dive into the carbon credit topic. So you might have heard of carbon credits. We've seen it over the past 6 to 8 months. You really can't open a farm magazine without reading about carbon credits anymore. It's an ever-evolving market, and you might wonder, why is carbon important? So certainly we've seen a big push towards reducing pollutants here in recent years. On the right, you can see the different greenhouse gas emissions that the EPA has measured, and carbon dioxide is there at 80%. So that's the one that they're really targeting right now. And all sectors are really having a push to reduce that carbon impact. There's different companies out there that are already voluntarily purchasing these carbon credits to offset their own emissions, similar to what we talked about with the water credit portion. And it's kind of exciting because agriculture has been deemed as part of the solution. And you can see here the different industries that the EPA measured in 2018 and their total greenhouse gas emissions. This isn't just carbon, but it shows the different sectors. And you can see there that agriculture is actually the smallest and down there at 10%. So let's think about the ways that we've improved things in agriculture over the past several years. This chart shows from 2012 to 2017 the different changes that we've had. You can see our conventional tillage has been shifted quite a bit, almost 25%. And we switched that to, whether it's conservation tillage or no-till, those have seen big ticks and increases. And then we're managing our tile and our water drainage better, and also cover crops. So that's a pretty small portion of the pie there, but a 50% increase over 5 years with 5 million acres there. That's a pretty big jump, but we still got a long ways to go. And these charts show just the different ways that agriculture has reduced its pollution over since 1980 on the crop side and 1990 on the livestock side. The livestock side shows your methane emissions. That's not carbon, but just an example of the different ways that we've seen pollution be decreased in that sector. On the crop side, there's been a lot of fluctuation there, but I would say that a lot of that has to do with our decreased fuel usage. And then, as we talked about, the different conservation practices that are being implemented. So we'll talk about the carbon cycle quick. The sun basically produces that CO2 for the plants to use. So it uses that in its growth process, and that CO2 is taken down into the roots and then used, and the soil organisms use it and convert that CO2. But the fewer times that we disturb that soil allows that CO2, the carbon, to be trapped in the soil. So that's kind of thinking about the process that we're using, and as you think about the different practices that we might use in order to sequester carbon in the soil. So how do we build soil carbon? Well, it's a lot of the different things that we've talked about already. Reducing the amount of times the soil is disturbed and that carbon can escape. Keeping those living root systems below ground all year round and producing that carbon, that's certainly a big portion of it as well. As you've got that crop residue decomposing on top, that can go down into the soil and increase your carbon too. And then we've seen a little bit of a push towards altering fertilizing methods. So limiting the usage that we have, and then reducing our reliance on commercial fertilizers and maybe including manure into your fertilizer plan. Maybe a more drastic one is changing crop rotations to a more long-term crop rotation. Think about maybe adding alfalfa or something like that to a farm. Not one that we're seeing on a wide scale for sure. Most of these carbon credit programs are geared towards corn and soybean production, but crop rotation could be a portion of it in the future. So we'll talk about the market structure. Basically, how this works is there are different carbon brokers, we'll call them, offering a carbon credit program. So they've got their program and offering the different dollar amounts for practice changes. They're really looking for farms where you can quantify a change in practices. So that might be reducing your tillage. That could be going from full tillage to no-till or somewhere in between. That can usually qualify for a practice change. Maybe adding a cover crop. Even adding a different mix of cover crop can sometimes qualify. So there's different ways to qualify, but they're really looking for those new initiatives in order to get someone signed up. So once someone signs up with a broker, then they make the practice changes. Once those changes are made at the end of the growing season, typically the carbon broker will try to estimate the amount of carbon that's sequestered. So really those estimates are mainly based on modeling. There's really not a whole lot of actual quantifiable evidence of the carbon that's being sequestered in the soil. There might be a minimal amount of soil sampling that's being done, but really they're using computer models and trying to estimate it that way. And that's what the market is showing right now, that they can take that and use that as those corporate buyers are purchasing those credits and using that to say that they're offsetting their own emissions. And then once that purchase is made, then typically the carbon broker will pay the producer for the credits that they earned. Some of the different carbon brokers that you might hear of out in this space, one is Indigo Ag, Nori, Land O'Lakes has a program, a company called SIBO has a program, and then some of your input suppliers like Bayer, Corteva, Nutrien, and there's several others out there as this continues to emerge. And one of the things that we're looking out for is potential USDA involvement. I know that there's been different hearings in the Senate and in the legislature about how carbon will be implemented, different carbon markets being implemented and how farmers will be impacted. So we'll keep an eye on that as we move forward with these markets. So thinking about this, it's really totally brand new. Most of these are pilot projects that started maybe a year or at most 2 years ago, but there's a lot of risk and uncertainty out there. For one, we've read through some of the contracts and most of them seem to be pretty flexible, but one of the things that we really need to think about is exactly what we're signing up for. Oftentimes they can require some long-term commitments for practice changes. So if you make that practice change and you don't want to, sometimes they might require you to continue to do that practice change, or you might have to pay some sort of penalty. So think about that. And like I said, these carbon calculations are really vague right now. So we'll continue to watch that as this market develops and see what these buyers really need to see, what data they might need from farmers in order to verify that carbon. So you're probably thinking, okay, this sounds great, but what's the money involved? And really right now, the reality is that it's not enough for many people to be incentivized to be participating in this market. Most companies are showing anywhere from half a ton to a ton of carbon sequestered per acre per year. Right now, they're typically paying anywhere from $15 to $20 per ton of carbon. But some of these programs are also structured to pay just for practice changes rather than measuring carbon. So that just depends on the program that you sign up with. We've seen payments anywhere from $3 to $40 per acre. Again, dependent on program, depending on the changes that you're making and the way that they're measuring that carbon. So it really fluctuates, but when you think back to cover crops can cost anywhere from $25 to $50 an acre. It's pretty difficult to convince someone to join in one of these programs. One other thing that I'll add is that there are certain programs that do not allow you to also participate in the government cost share for these programs if you're making a switch to no-till or cover crops. But most of them allow you to do what we'll call a double dip. So you can take that cost share money and take the carbon credit money. But again, dependent on your program. And really we're looking at, okay, where does this market go from here? There's a pretty minimal amount of companies that are purchasing carbon credits right now. We've seen some large companies like Pepsi, Walmart, making sustainability issues and purchasing these carbon credits. So as we see maybe more of an initiative, requirements for people to offset their pollution, there's going to be a lot more demand out there. So we could see, we've heard estimates of anywhere from $50 to $75 per ton of carbon in the future. So it's hard to say exactly where it's going to go from here, but right now we think we could be at the low end of the market. And one of the things that we're thinking about here as we near some lease termination deadlines and thinking about your leases for 2022, we have been recommending to include clauses in your leases for the following things like who has the right to agree to a carbon contract. So we're basically seeing it as the tenant needs to have landowner permission in order to participate in one of these programs. Again, thinking about who gets paid. So maybe you're requiring these sorts of practices to be implemented on your farm. Maybe you're providing a little bit of money to get a cover crop applied on your farm. Do you deserve some of that payment? That's really going to be a farm by farm basis. I can't answer that for you right now, but that's something to think about. And then think about how you're sharing the costs. If you want to see some of this carbon credit money, you might want to think about that as well. And then finally, think about what happens if your lease is terminated. A lot of these different programs have different ways that when a lease is terminated, how that transfers, those carbon credits transfer from farm to farm. So that program might stay with your farm. It could go with the tenant and leave that way. So think about that and think about, the real estate side. You might want to know whether there's carbon credits being sequestered on your farm if you go to sell it. So another thing to think about. So we covered a lot of ground today and talked about different things that you might be implementing on your farm. So a lot of things to think about and a lot of excitement. So I'll turn it back over to you, Casey.